As my lovely introduction said, my name is Rachel, and as well as having worked in education for 30 years, I've also trained as a psychotherapist and more recently a life coach. And I specialise in working with teachers and other educational professionals, partly because that's my background and I understand it very well, but partly because I do think that as teachers, we perhaps have a bit more of a tendency than the general population towards these kinds of beliefs. So when I was asked to do a webinar on teacher wellbeing, I decided to take a slightly different approach, and rather than tell you about some of the things that you could do in order to look after yourself better, the question that I'm asking is this one. Okay, why aren't you looking after yourself better? Because a lot of the time we actually know what we should be doing, but we're not necessarily doing it. And so the questions at the beginning were to get you thinking about your mindset and your beliefs, and that's what we're going to be kind of exploring later on in this session. Okay, so let's make a start then. So, yes, as I said, the title is Teacher Wellbeing, Why Aren't You Looking After Yourself Better? Because we know that teaching is a stressful job. And I saw in the chat before we started this session that you were recognising this yourself. We often talk about an epidemic of stress. So this comes from The Guardian, which is a UK newspaper, quite recently in November. They reported on a recent survey into teachers, and it gets worse every year basically. So as it says here, it's the highest levels ever, with nearly 3/4 of teachers and 84% of school leaders describing themselves as stressed. More than a third of education professionals have experienced a mental health issue in the past academic year. And almost half believe their workplace is having a negative impact on their mental health and well-being. I mean, these kinds of figures are shocking. And I strongly suspect that this is not just happening in the UK. So, let's start with that. What's your impression of what's happening in Spain or wherever you may be based? Is it similar to this? I'll just wait and see some comments from the chat box. Yeah, I think so, exactly the same. Yes, similar, absolutely. Yeah, okay. I mean, I'm not surprised to see this, to be honest, because I don't think by any means that this is something that's just happening in the UK, unfortunately. Yes, I mean, Carlos says we have more work and demands every year. Yes, so let's have a look at some of the reasons for this. Why is there this epidemic of stress with teaching? Why is teaching so stressful? Well, I mean, I think there are different factors going on here. Teaching is physically demanding. So, you're not just sitting at a desk, you're on your feet most of the day. You're having to react and respond to maybe 30 or more students at the same time. Teachers often work very long hours, often without a break, because break times are often the time when students come and ask you questions or you have other duties to do in the school. Teachers do sometimes have longer holidays, though by no means always. But, during term time, the work is extremely intense and physically demanding. It's also mentally demanding, clearly. As mentioned before, teachers are interacting with lots of different people at the same time, all of whom have different needs. They get questions fired at them, and they're mainly responsible for ensuring that the class goes smoothly and that the time is used efficiently. And they have so many different things to think about. And we know from research that this kind of scattered attention, where you're paying attention to lots of different things, is extremely demanding and exhausting. And it tends to create an overproduction of stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. And so these are still swirling around our bodies long after we've finished teaching, which is why it can be difficult to wind down, switch off and go to sleep in the evening. Teaching is also emotionally demanding. Many teachers feel very responsible for their students. They're deeply empathetic people. They care, which is a good thing. And, let's face it, this is why people want to be teachers, because they want to make a difference. And there are good sides to this, of course, but there are also drawbacks. And, the drawback is that it is emotionally exhausting dealing with the emotional needs of lots of people at once. And the external factors, and these were mentioned just now in the chat box, there's more and more pressure to produce good results. Class sizes are getting bigger. Behaviour from students is often getting worse. Yes, as Enrique says, our society is more and more complex. I think that's absolutely right. And, less job security, less funding. And this is, before we take into account the stress that's being caused by the current situation with coronavirus. I mean, even before that happened, there were lots of external stressful factors. And of course now, even more so. So it's no surprise at all, I think, that all of this can lead to teachers burning out. And that's why I think we have such high rates of burnout in this profession, despite the positive sides of it as well. So I mentioned the word burnout. How would you define burnout? Can you put your ideas in the chat box? What's a good definition for you of burnout? There's the question. I can see multiple attendees are typing. Okay, so tired, fed up, demotivated, unable to think. Yeah, brain fog is often the moment when you explode, nothing seems to matter anymore. Stressful, anxious, exhausted, drained. Yes, I mean, I think you have a good understanding of this, and I am concerned in some ways because I think you may understand it because you're experiencing it. This is the World Health Organization definition. So burnout is a syndrome resulting from chronic workplace stress that has not been successfully managed. So I think that there are two key things here to bear in mind. One is chronic workplace stress, and the other one is not being successfully managed. Okay, now the chronic thing is important because, in fact, there is nothing wrong with stress per se. It's a perfectly natural reaction that we have to a situation where we feel threatened. So, if you imagine yourself living in a Stone Age village a few thousand years ago, and you see a tiger, you get a stress response. So your body prepares itself to either fight the tiger or, probably more sensibly, run away from the tiger, or possibly freeze and hope that it doesn't notice you. So you get this physical response, you get chemicals coming into your system that will help you to do those things. Blood flows away from your brain and goes into your muscles. Your digestion stops because nobody needs to be digesting their dinner when they have to run away from a tiger. Right? So, we have this kind of burst of energy, and then if you're not eaten by the tiger, you relax. Okay, and this kind of thing doesn't happen that often in your Stone Age life. Right? However, when you are living in the modern world, your body is not, your brain primarily, doesn't really understand that we're not being threatened in the same kind of about to lose our life kind of way. So we get a very similar response. We get this huge surge of adrenaline and cortisol and stress hormones, but it's happening all the time. It's not just happening every so often when we come up against a real danger like a tiger. And that's what we mean by chronic stress. And because it's happening so frequently, and because we don't have the opportunity, or we don't give ourselves the opportunity to restore the balance and to rest and relax, these stress hormones just build up and up and up. And that's where we have the problem. Right? So the stress response in itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but if it's chronic and if it's not managed correctly, these are the kinds of things that it can lead to. And, I'm just talking about health problems here, but obviously there are psychological problems as well, which we'll talk about. But, you can see that this is really quite a scary list. And I'm not apologizing in a way for this being a bit scary, because I want you to take it seriously. If stress is not managed correctly, it can do you physically a lot of harm, as well as the emotional and mental harm. And the other thing to say, I think, is that stress can very often creep up on us. So very often we're not really fully aware of quite how stressed we are, because it just kind of feels normal, and because everyone around us is the same. We sometimes don't notice how stressed we are until it gets to a point where we're close to burnout. So you mentioned, quite a few of you have mentioned about sort of not having motivation, feeling, not interested in your work anymore. And I think that is actually often a key sign of burnout, particularly if you've always been the kind of person who's not that interested in your job, then that isn't a sign of burnout. But for most teachers, they're very motivated, they're very passionate, and if they lose that, then that often is an indicator that stress is reaching those kinds of levels. Some other warning signs of burnout that I think, that we need to look out for. Again, this has been mentioned by quite a few people. Chronic exhaustion. Now, I saw somebody say in the chat box a minute ago, that it's different from being tired. And yes, I think we do need to make a distinction here, because being tired, even exhausted, but you have a rest and then you feel better, is not what I mean by chronic exhaustion. So when it's chronic exhaustion, it doesn't matter if you get a good night's sleep, you still feel exhausted when you wake up in the morning. It doesn't matter if you take a break over the weekend, you still feel dreadful on Monday morning. So this is what I mean by chronic exhaustion. It isn't solved by just getting a good night's sleep. Second one, I think, to watch out for is low immunity. Clearly not anything that we want particularly at the moment. But if you're the kind of person who constantly catches colds, if there's any kind of bug going around, you will get it. That is usually a sign that your immune system is depressed by stress, because stress kind of makes it doesn't prioritize our immune system, let's say, because it's just focusing on getting us away from that tiger. So that's the second thing I think to look for. And then the third one is this idea of that I have called overflow. And by overflow, I mean that even quite small things that perhaps normally you wouldn't worry about too much, like not being able to find your car keys, for example, or your partner leaving their dirty clothes on the floor. You can't just shrug these off. You find yourself getting angry or bursting into tears, and you know that the reaction is out of proportion to what's happened. And that, I think, is another key sign that your stress levels are too high. So, if this is all kind of reminding you of how you feel, I'll show you the link at the end, but there is a quiz on my website which you can do, which will give you a more in-depth analysis of whether you are close to burnout, and also give you some more advice about what to do about it. So we know that we know that teaching is a very challenging job. I just got that the wrong way around. And particularly at the moment. I saw this quote somewhere on social media recently, saying that for teachers, this is our Olympics. You know, our students need us more than ever. You know, we're there to help them through this difficult time. And this is kind of what we've been training for, if you like, in the way that athletes train for Olympics. But when athletes train for Olympics, what do they do in order to get ready for the Olympics? Just put a few suggestions in the chat box. Oh, apologies, that's my dog. Yeah, so how do they prepare themselves, Rosina? Train hard, work out. What else? Okay, routine. Okay, they have time, says Virginia. Right. Yes, okay, thank you. We've got to take care of ourselves, eat right. Okay, exactly. So they don't train sort of on empty. Right? In order for an athlete to train, they have to eat the right foods. They have to sleep enough. They have to really look after themselves because their bodies need to be in perfect condition in order to deal with the Olympics. So you don't find athletes going into the Olympics, you know, on no sleep and not having had a holiday for months and, you know, eating biscuits rather than dinner. Right? So this is the same for us, you know, in order to get through the challenges of the everyday challenges of being a teacher, but particularly at the moment, we need to treat ourselves like athletes, all right, and really look after ourselves. So first question for you then, what are you doing at the moment that you're actually doing, not that you think you might like to do, what are you actually doing at the moment to look after yourself in the way that an athlete would look after themselves in order to deal with the current challenge? You know, so Christine, you say mental balance for it. How are you helping yourself to get this mental balance? Okay, sleep a lot, that's a good one. Yoga, mindfulness, meditation, exercise outdoors. Okay, good suggestions here, great. So if you were doing those things, brilliant. Okay, keep doing them. Okay, next question, all right, it relates to this slide, okay. So many people that I speak to in my work as a coach say to me, I know what I should be doing, but, right? So we generally know the things that we need to do in order to look after ourselves physically, mentally, and emotionally. Right? However, we often are not doing them. Right? So what I'd like you to do now is to write in the chat box, let's say 3 things, all right, that you know that you should be doing or that you wish you were doing or that you would like to be doing, but you're not. Right. Okay, so Sarah says eating better, exercise, and closing tabs before I go to sleep. Right. Okay, yeah, so come up with some, practice sports, relax, sleep better. Right. Dancing, oh, good choice. Resting, stop working for hours, sleep more. It's moving quite fast, all right? Spend less time in front of the computer. I can't see everybody's, but not eating junk food, exercising enough sleep. Okay, great. So remember those, all right, because we'll come back to them. Okay, we'll come back to them later. So these are the statements that were up on the slide at the beginning of the webinar, if you were here in the break. So do you sometimes feel these ways? I know some of you started discussing this, but do any of these ring bells with you? If you want to, you can, put something in the chat box. You don't have to, if you don't want to admit to it. Okay, so I'm seeing quite a lot of agreement. Right. I'm not surprised. I think many of us have these feelings and beliefs, and I think teachers, as I said at the beginning, are perhaps particularly likely to feel these ways. I think it's kind of in the nature of teachers because they're people who like helping others. So, why aren't we looking after ourselves better? Often, I think, it's because of these kinds of deep-seated beliefs and mindset. And often we're not even really that aware of it because that's just how we've always seen things. And so we can be driven by our subconscious to behave in ways that just don't really serve us, that are not helping us. So, what percentage of brain activity do you think is subconscious? Have a guess at a percentage. So what percentage of our brain activity do you think is subconscious? Okay, we've got 30%, 75, 180. Not sure you can have that as a percentage. 50, 90, 20. Oh, there's a lot of variety. Okay, I'll tell you. Okay, so according to research, 95 to 99% of brain activity is subconscious. Does that surprise you? Yes, clearly it surprises Rosina. Now, we shouldn't really be that surprised if you think about it, because most of what we do kind of has to be automated. We wouldn't be able to function if we had to consciously think through every tiny movement that we make, for example. So most of what we do is automated, and that's how we manage to do a lot of very complicated things. That's why when you first start teaching, for example, it's much harder work than when you're more experienced, because a lot of what you do in the classroom has become automated. Or when you learn to drive a car, when you first start learning to drive, well, certainly this was my experience, you can't understand how people can manage to change gears, indicate, steer, look out the window, and do it all at once. All right? And that's because we automate these things. So that's fine, but the problem is we also often automate things that actually aren't in our best interests. So the brain sets up these sort of shortcuts, which we can refer to as neural pathways, and we just go down the same path again and again and again, totally unconsciously. Yes, Susanna says working memory is very short. That's right. So we need these shortcuts. However, some shortcuts are really not at all helpful. So even if we consciously disagree with some of those statements that we just looked at, unconsciously we may still be being driven by them. So let's look at these sort of one in turn. So the first one then, so when I try and stop and relax, I feel uncomfortable. Now, if that's true for you, there could be a couple of things going on. Firstly, and I should mention this first, I think, it could be a physical thing. It might not be a mindset thing at all. When we produce a lot of stress hormones, our body is constantly on alert. And so when we stop, we still have all those stress hormones going around our body, and our brain, our subconscious brain, is still going, what are you doing resting? There's a tiger in the village, So that could be part of the reason why you find it hard to stop and relax. It could just be physical. On the other hand, and some of you have already said this, it may be that you feel uncomfortable because you feel guilty. You feel there are so many things to be done, as Ingrid says. So you may have some deep-seated beliefs about work and relaxation. So these are obviously sayings in English, but I'm sure that there are equivalents in Spanish or in your first language if it's not Spanish. Do you recognize any of these from your childhood or from your upbringing? Are these the kinds of things that perhaps your parents or grandparents used to say? All right. Oh, yes, I'm seeing lots and lots of yeses. All right. Okay. Yes. All right. So, this is not about, blaming our parents for anything. All right. But we pick up these things from our upbringing. And when we're children and we hear things like this a lot, we tend to just totally swallow those beliefs, and we don't question them, because why would we question things that we learn from our parents? They show us the world and they show us what to do. Sarah says, yeah, upbringing and being a woman. Yes, but it's also about how you've been brought up to see the role of a woman, and I'm no different. Right? So I was brought up with quite a few of these kinds of sayings. So if you have this subconscious belief that, taking a rest is somehow wicked, or, the devil makes work for idle hands, that you shouldn't put things off, that it's necessary to suffer in order to achieve, right, then you're going to find it very hard to go against that programming. Right. So what can you do about that? So what you can do is to start to become more aware of that programming and to question it in the way that you wouldn't have done as a child. And to do that, you can ask yourself these 4 questions. So these 4 questions come from Byron Katie's work, and I just think they're very, very useful questions to ask yourself. So the first one is it true? So let's look at an example. Hard work never hurt anyone. Is it true? Well, initially you might say, yes, of course it's true. But if you think it more deeply, can you absolutely know that it's true? Well, no, you can't, because in fact you can probably think of lots of examples where hard work has hurt people. Right? The third one, this is an interesting one. What happens when you believe it? Okay, so what happens when you believe that hard work never hurt anyone? I would suggest that what happens probably is that you push yourself harder than you should, that you don't take enough, don't pay enough attention to your own health, and that you probably end up getting ill because you work too hard. And then the fourth question is, how would your life be different if you didn't believe it? Right? So how would it be different if you didn't believe that hard work never hurt anyone? Well, perhaps you'd be kinder to yourself. Perhaps you would go and have a nap if you were doing some marking and you felt exhausted. So it's really worth thinking about these 4 questions and questioning these beliefs. Okay, let's look at the second one. Right, so if a thing's worth doing, it's worth doing perfectly. Right. So, if you always set yourself very high standards, you have a tendency to criticize yourself, you spend hours creating perfect lesson plans, choosing exactly the right exercise or exactly the right image, and you think that the world will fall apart if you make a mistake, all right, then you're probably aware that you're something of a perfectionist, yes? So, what are the benefits of being a perfectionist? All right, there are some, I think. Right, so yeah, I'm just looking here. Sarah says hard work is positive, prioritize is basic, though. Yeah, so, I'm not saying that hard work, that you should never work hard, but it has to be balanced. I think that's the thing. Right. So what are there are benefits to being a perfectionist, or you wouldn't do it if you are a perfectionist. Right? Yes, so Elizabeth says good results. Okay. You feel proud of the task done. All right. And Nuria, you can lose your health. Absolutely, that's a disadvantage. All right, and we'll get to that. But, let's be honest with ourselves. There are, of course, advantages to being a workaholic and to being a perfectionist. You will produce excellent work. You will get lots of praise from people, and who doesn't like praise? you will probably do well in your career. However, and now let's talk about the downsides, right? If you are a perfectionist rather than trying to do well but not perfectly all the time, there is no such word as that, but it's a good idea. You are also going to come up against some problems, as you're mentioning. So here are some potential disadvantages. Okay, if you're a perfectionist, you're probably going to be a highly critical person. You'll be highly critical of yourself, but you're also quite likely to be highly critical of other people as well. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have very supportive relationships, say, with other people at work. And you're also going to pass on that criticism to your children. You're likely to be quite defensive and unwilling to learn from mistakes because you're so concerned with being perfect. And actually, mistakes are often the best way to learn. If you're always focused on a goal and not on the process, then you're going to miss a lot of things because you're going to be always thinking, when I've done this, when I've done that, when I've finished this, and always looking ahead and missing your life that's happening at the moment. You're going to probably suffer from a lot of fear of failure because obviously, actually, people can't be perfect all the time. And if you expect that of yourself, then you're going to worry a lot about not achieving that perfection. And in fact, and I saw somebody mention procrastination earlier, you're actually quite likely to be a procrastinator because if you feel the need to do everything perfectly, that often stops you from doing anything at all because you don't want to do it unless you can do it perfectly. So there are actually a lot of disadvantages to being a perfectionist. So if this sounds like you, again, try to become more aware of those sort of thoughts and beliefs. And when you catch yourself kind of believing that something has to be perfect, question it. You could try using the 4 questions that I showed you. But, ask yourself, honestly, if what you are obsessing about is really that important. And very often when you look at something consciously rather than just sort of subconsciously being pulled along by it, you'll see that it probably won't matter in a week's time or a month's time or a year's time. This is one of my favourite quotes. The greatest mistake you can make in life is to be continually fearing you will make one. We all make mistakes. Right? Christina says, I don't agree with procrastination when you're a perfectionist. Yeah, not all perfectionists procrastinate, but a surprising amount do, actually, because they don't want to risk making a mistake, and so they can't quite get started on something. I see it quite a lot, but it doesn't apply to all perfectionists. Okay, so the third one. All right, now, just from what I've seen in the chat box, I think probably quite a few of you relate to this one. Many people, including me, were brought up to believe that they should always put the needs of others before their own. Now, this sounds like a nice thing to do, and of course in some ways it is. Right? If we care about other people, then obviously we want to do what's right for them. Right? And certainly we should put other people up high on our list of priorities. I'm not suggesting that we should all be horrible, selfish people and never do anything for anyone else. Right? However, if we don't want to burn out, we have to recognize the truth in the saying that you can't pour water from an empty vessel. If you always put yourself last, you will eventually run out of water or energy or time. And you will start to feel resentful about it. You'll probably get ill and you'll burn out. And I think that, teachers are can be particularly vulnerable, I think, to this way of thinking, as I mentioned, because they're people who have a vocation, because their job is helping other people. And, that's great, but it has to be balanced. It's not selfish to look after yourself. Your family do not want you to be a burnt out wreck. They care about you. They want to see you well. I'm sure your students also care about you and don't want you to be a burnt out wreck. And actually, you won't be that nice to be around if you are exhausted and resentful and secretly angry about all the demands that people are putting on you. So, human beings need good food, rest, exercise, time to do fun things. And if you don't give yourself these things, other people won't necessarily do it for you. Often I think people kind of hope and expect that if they give lots and lots and lots to other people, that they will get it back from those people. But it doesn't always work that way. So you have to take the responsibility for looking after yourself. Okay, now if you find this difficult, and a lot of us do, a good tip that I would give you is to imagine what you would say to a friend who was in the same situation as you. So let's imagine, that you're really struggling with work, you're exhausted, but you feel really guilty about not continuing the way that you are. If a friend said that to you, what would you say to them? And how would you say it? What kind of tone of voice would you use? Just put your ideas in the chat box for that. So what would you say to a friend who was close to burnout? Just looking at some suggestions. Okay, so rest, relax, take it easy. I don't think you would say to them, God, you're such a selfish person. I can't believe that you're saying that. Get on with it. Pull yourself together, work harder, right? You wouldn't say those things to a friend, but we often say them to ourselves. Right? Is that not true? Right? We often say things to ourselves that we would never say to a friend. Pull yourself together, stop being selfish, work harder. Right? So I think we need to be our own best friend and treat ourselves at least as well as we would treat somebody else, not much worse than we would treat somebody else. Because look, I'm seeing all sorts of really nice messages here that you would say to your friends. So say these things to yourself, okay? All right, so I find it really difficult to say no. Okay, how many people can relate to this one then? I'd be surprised if it's not quite a few, I think. Yeah, okay. Yes, I'm not at all surprised. I mean, most people, I think, have a difficulty with this, and I think that teachers in particular tend to be the kind of person who finds it hard to say no. We were probably brought up to be nice and kind and help people. We may be worried that people won't like us if we say no. Or, and this is another one to consider, often we don't say no because actually we're really passionate about what we do and we love it and we really want to say yes. And actually that is also not a reason to say yes, tempting though it may be. Right. And I'll tell you why in a moment. Right. I'm learning, but it's difficult. Okay, well, so which of these things would you find it hard to say no to? Because these are some of the things I hear about very often from clients. All of them. Okay, well, that's simple. Okay, so, there is a reality to your job as a teacher. Sometimes you might not be able to say no. Okay? Maybe covering for a colleague who's off sick, you know that if you don't agree, the school is going to be in, a real problem. Right? So there are situations where you may have to say yes. However, in that case, there should be other situations where you're saying no. Right? So, for example, being expected to answer emails from students or parents in your own time, for me, that's a good example of something that you perhaps shouldn't be expected to do, or that you could put some limits on. Ultimately, it depends on your situation, what you feel is reasonable to say yes to. But you have to bear in mind that every time you say yes to something extra, you are saying no to something else. And you might be saying no to enough sleep. You might be saying no to time with your family at the weekend. You might be saying no to, having a holiday with your family. So when you say yes to something extra, you need to be really conscious of the fact that you're saying no to something else. And that also goes for situations where you're saying yes to something that you actually want to do, but that you haven't really got the time or energy for. So it does require some self-discipline as well. It's not just about saying no to things that you don't want to do. A tip for you, if you find it hard to say no to things, and as I say, most of us do, is to train yourself to always ask for some time to think about it. Or if you get an email, don't respond to the email straight away, right? Unless you have to, obviously, if it's an emergency. But if you give yourself that little bit of time, often you can then make a better decision. If you agree to something immediately, the chances are you're going to regret it later. So try and train yourself to always kind of say, oh, okay, yes, can I just think about that and I'll get back to you, even if it's only 10 minutes later. All right. So give yourself that little bit of time. Celia says that's procrastination. No. This is giving yourself some cushion time to think about whether or not you are actually really okay with agreeing to something, because there is nothing worse than saying yes to something and then feeling really, angry and resentful and upset afterwards that you agreed to it, because actually you don't have the capacity to do it. Right. So as I said, yes, if you say yes to something extra, what else are you saying no to? And you really need to consider that. Often we kind of act as if we had infinite time and infinite energy, and we don't. Right? There only is so much. Okay, so last one then. I'm the one holding everything together. So teachers know, right, that, I just want to say to Sarah here, because that's such a good point, Sarah, sometimes it's patronising because we think the others might not do it right. That is absolutely true. I think a lot of people, and I've done it myself, say yes to things because they don't trust other people to do them. And if that is you, then you need to get over it and let other people make their mistakes if they're going to. Right? But I've been like that myself, so I totally get it. Okay, so I'm the one holding everything together. Teachers know that people rely on them, their students, their colleagues, so they often tell themselves that they have to be strong and carry on no matter what's happening to them. If they're struggling emotionally or physically, they often won't tell anyone. They maybe won't even admit it to themselves, and they push it all down until, every holiday, this used to happen to me, and every holiday I got ill. I don't know if any of you are like that, because I would kind of keep going, be strong, all right, and then I would get ill every holiday. And it absolutely infuriated my husband because, we'd go on holiday and I'd be in bed ill and he'd be having to take the children out and about, and they were little. And this is because, we have this feeling that we have to stay strong. And I think this is a very common kind of driver for teachers. But I think one thing that I've really learned here is, that actually asking for help is not a sign of weakness, firstly. And secondly, people actually often like being asked for help. You're giving them the opportunity to feel good. Right? So you don't have to carry everything yourself. Right? And you are allowed to say no to things. You are allowed to not do things completely perfectly, right? And you don't have to always be the one that's holding things together. So let's go back now then to the things that you wrote down that you weren't currently doing to look after yourself, but that you know that you should or that you would like to be doing. So why aren't you doing those things? Yeah, Sarah says, I've been ill for long periods of time and things keep on going. Yes, well, exactly. I mean, I'm sorry to hear you've been ill, but it's good when we notice that, because it means we're not indispensable. Nobody is totally indispensable. So tell me then, why are you not doing those things that you know that you should be doing? Have you identified any reasons from watching the webinar? You don't have to write it in the chat box if you don't want to, but think about it. Why are you not looking after yourself, as the question was? Maybe you need to have different priorities. Okay, Maria says, I think things should be done my way. Okay, well done for recognizing that. Okay, so what are you going to do about that? Are you going to continue making yourself ill in order to have things done your way? Okay, Sarah says laziness, lack of time. I somehow suspect that I don't believe the laziness. I don't think you'd be at this webinar if you were a lazy person. Okay, everything else is more important. That's a good one. So everything else is more important than your health. Is that really true? As the questions go, do you know that that's true? How would it feel if you didn't believe that? And what impact does it have on your life, believing that everything else is more important? Yes, I haven't read the Burnout Society, but I'm going to check that out, Andres. I took a note of that earlier. We are our own enslavers. Absolutely. All right, we are. All right. Now, this is not to say that I think that problems are not caused by employers and by, situations at work. And I'm not saying that it's all down to you, but you generally don't have that much control over what your employers are doing and their policies, but you do have control over yourself and your beliefs and the choices that you make. And that's what I'm asking you to think about. Really question why you aren't looking after yourself better and do something about it. Question those beliefs, right? And change the way that you're approaching things, and don't go into burnout. I've been there myself. I've made myself quite ill. I still have an autoimmune kidney disease that I developed 20 years ago. Don't do it. It's not worth it. So this is my website, which I mentioned earlier, and there is a quiz on there which you can do if you want to find out more about burnout. And Life Resourceful Lightbulb Moments is my Facebook group. If you're interested in the kinds of things we've been talking about, come and join us in the Facebook group. There's nearly 400 teachers and other education professionals in there. And of course you can contact me through either of those two ways. So thank you very much. We've still got a bit of time if anybody has any questions. Almudena says you should talk about this to the Spanish government. Yeah, well, and the UK government, believe me. As you get older, you realise you have to be more selfish, family first, and after that you first. Yes, well, I think actually you first and then family, because you can't look after your family unless you look after you. You enlighten us. That sounds good. I really hope that you've managed to take something away from this and that you will kind of take some steps to look after yourself better.